Hi folks, let's do a follow-up lecture on the topic of trauma and dissociation, and let's criticize it this time and consider some of the counter arguments against what we heard in the last lecture. This is a difficult topic for me to lecture on because I get so frustrated with jumps in logic in trauma dissociation theory. I remember many years ago when the 2012 Dallenberg paper coming out, being in the Loftus lab and hearing individuals who were involved in the reply to Dallenberg's study, so they were involved in the Lin et al. Reply, saying that, do we have to read another 30-page paper and debunk it? It's an enormous amount of work to deal with the volume of work that trauma and dissociation advocates put out and then to debunk it. And I had the same feeling myself when Harold Merkelbach approached me in 2017. He showed me some of the papers written by Bethany Brand, a couple of papers that we mentioned in the last lecture. And he said, do you want to do a commentary on this? And it was just such a long read and a mentally difficult task of reading things that we don't agree with and then replying to them and then getting accused of all sorts of things ad hominem as a result of our replies and then replying again. And it is a difficult task to take on, debunking trauma and dissociation theorists. And in this lecture, I'll talk about some of the problems that I think there is in the field. I think I've come to the position where there's some agreement, right? So, for example, I agree that if you measure trauma and you measure dissociation in a certain way, you will find a low correlation. I agree with that. Now, the reason why that happens, I might explain differently to the trauma dissociation theorists. So for me, those who've been exposed to trauma likely have undergone some stress over a period of time that may have affected their memory. And then when they answer questions on memory in the dissociative experiences scale, they may score themselves lower in the dissociation scale. Same with going through trauma and then feeling depersonalized. I think there might be, if you go through something shocking, then just feeling outside of yourself sometimes might be another thing. But what I don't kind of agree with is that dissociation is a real singular thing. So even though these two measures correlate with each other, I don't really even subscribe to the idea that trauma is a cause of dissociation. It's more like stress causes memory problems. That's how I see it. It's more exact. The way I want to think about it is more exact. So, a stress response is a more exact measure, a more closely defined measure than trauma, because trauma can include too many different things and it's too broad of a measure. Same with dissociation. Dissociation is too broad of a measure. So I think science should be about precision and measuring singular entities. So a stress response causing a problem with memory, a few years of stress causes memory problems. Yes, that is science. But broadening these definitions to say trauma causes dissociation when dissociation consists of 4 or 5 different things, I don't think that is science. So that's the first problem with it. The second problem with it is, even though I agree that these two measures correlate with each other, and I kind of think that there's a causal mechanism there, just a small cause, obviously, because the correlations are small. The cause is just one of many. So something like stress causes memory problems or feelings of depersonalization, right? I kind of agree with that, but only to a small extent because the effect sizes are small. There's some agreement there with trauma dissociation theories, but where I start to really disagree is there's this logical gap, which I find kind of insane, that means that trauma leads to dissociative amnesia. But when you really look at what dissociative amnesia is in the DSM, it is autobiographical memory which is blocked, but it is stored. But there's a period of time where you do not even know where it's inaccessible. So how do you know it's been stored if it's inaccessible? So during that period of dissociative amnesia, how do you test scientifically whether it's stored? You can't, because if you find that it's inaccessible, that is not evidence that it's stored. If you find that it is recalled, then you say, oh yes, we've got proof that it's stored, right? So it really comes down to the difficulty of measurement of how do you know something is stored in memory. The only way that we know is by memory report. All right, so how would anybody know that something is stored in memory if it is inaccessible? Because if there's no memory report, you do not know that it's been stored. So that's one problem. Then the definition of dissociative amnesia is even more complex than that. It cannot be due to anything physical, such as a head injury. How can you possibly rule out a head injury or a medical condition or a substance problem or a physical condition of the brain, such as changes in brain chemistry? How can you rule out all of those out when somebody does forget something in a case that they call dissociative amnesia? It's almost impossible to rule out those. And in real cases that they name dissociative amnesia and they put into the studies, they do not rule out all of these things, even though they should, because it's almost impossible to rule out all of those physical possible causes. So when I see case reports of dissociative amnesia in the literature, and Ivan Manguelli in Maastricht and Leuven University has looked at some of these, what you find is there is no evidence, strong evidence of causal relationships. The practitioners often guess that it is psychogenic trauma that is causing the forgetting, right? So that's one problem with dissociative amnesia. And then the other final problem of dissociative amnesia is that the theory says that you can recall things pristinely afterwards. Now, how do you know that it's pristinely recalled? How do you know that it's actually true? How do you measure that? How do you know that the forgetting was caused by trauma? At the point of time of recall, and you ask people, how, was this ever inaccessible? The individuals cannot really tell you that it is inaccessible, because we're so bad at judging how we remembered things or how we perceive things in the past. In other words, so we might think it was inaccessible, but we in fact are misremembering we could access that memory. So that's one problem. And then these correlations between trauma and dissociation, and then stretch it into dissociative identity disorder to say that severe trauma can cause severe dissociative identity disorder. It's a jump in logic. So yes, I agree that they've established a small correlation between trauma and dissociation. I don't like the measures, but okay, I agree. But then to jump to dissociative amnesia, I've told you how that doesn't make sense. But then to jump into these individuals can develop multiple personality states. And it's not the case that the practitioners are saying that they have a delusion of multiple personality states. In the literature, in the DSM, it says that they actually do have multiple personality states. Now, I think this comes from folklore. I think this comes from information passed down from one generation to the next. That is not correct. I don't think anybody actually does have more than one personality. The definition of a personality, the very definition of a personality, is all of the behaviors that one person has. You cannot have, it goes against that definition to say that there's more than one of those things, one entities, those states or personalities inside a single person. It's wordplay. It doesn't make sense. So when I read trauma and dissociation literature, they stay away from the more controversial things, but they would use the articles to reinforce their ideas in a court case involving dissociative identity disorder. So if you notice, they don't talk about the causal mechanisms or how in the Dallenberg 2012 paper or the Brand et al. 2017 papers, both of them, you notice that their focus is on establishing that trauma causes dissociation. They don't really establish that trauma causes dissociative identity disorder. But what they will do is use those articles and that expertise in court cases where somebody with dissociative identity disorder is using memory evidence. And so they'll use Bethany Brand's work and Constance Dalensberg's work to say, oh, maybe this recalled recovered memories could be true because we understand all of this about dissociative symptoms and trauma and dissociation theory. So it's a much less well-established theory as it appears on the page, right? So these long articles by Dallenberg and Brand are so convincing to individuals who might be naive to the theory. For somebody like me, I see what they're doing. They're trying to legitimize recovered repressed memory evidence, basically. And I think that is something that we address in our criticism of Brand's studies, where I and Harold Merkelbach argued the case that, yes, we kind of agree that trauma may be correlated with dissociation, but we don't agree with the other steps of logic, such as we don't think that is evidence for dissociative amnesia, you know, the strict definition of dissociative amnesia that you can pull out of the DSM, and we don't think that's evidence of dissociative identity disorder either. So to sum up some of my criticism, what I would like to see is the theoretical baggage of trauma dissociation theory taken out of the DSM. And to do that, I think you would have to change the word dissociative amnesia to amnesia, right? So you could, you know, where there's no kind of inference of why the amnesia is there. All right, so that's something that each individual case you can do an analysis of, and you can find out, yes, well, we're not sure what the amnesia is for, but so some general cases of amnesia are really genuine, and some of them may have been traumatized, some of them may have not been traumatized, but calling it dissociative amnesia kind of gets people thinking in a way that it must be psychogenic trauma rather than that's a causal aspect of the amnesia rather than a head injury or just stress, right? So years of stress will lead to lower memory, but it's not the trauma in the experience that is ruining memory. It's more like stress, and then the hippocampus gets smaller over time, that kind of thing. So I don't like the way that the word dissociative is used in front of these words, right? So I would prefer to see a section on amnesia, not dissociative amnesia. I think you would probably still need an identity disorder section in the DSM, but taking away the word dissociative would be good, because it would take away any guesswork of what the cause is. Whenever you use the word dissociative identity disorder, it kind of implies that it is because of trauma, and the trauma led to dissociation, and then they have identity disorders. Now, I think it is going to be the case that somebody who does have identity disorders, such as delusions, that they have more than one person inside their head, I think they probably have had a stressful life beforehand that leads up to that, or maybe drugs, or maybe head injuries, maybe genetics, developmental problems. But even though most of those people will have had stressful lives beforehand, I don't think you should assume that it is a trauma that is directly causing the identity problems. First of all, trauma is a little bit of a circular concept, in that the word trauma implies that something that happens that causes problems later. I would be much happier if we got more exact about it. So you could say years of stress in a stressful home environment leads to brain difficulties later that leads to people having problems with their identity, or some interruption in the identity formation during adolescence leads to identity problems later on, or iatrogenic suggestions from online videos about dissociative identity disorder lead to reports of identity problems. So those are the kind of changes I would like to see made to the DSM and the ICD, and I'm not very confident that these will ever come about in my lifetime. I can see when I read the DSM-5 and the ICD-11 that a lot of debate has gone between the two warring factions who you might imagine on one of these committees at the DSM. So you have one group of psychiatrists who are kind of skeptical of the idea that dissociative amnesia is caused by trauma, so they just compromise with those who do think it's caused by trauma by removing some of the language and saying that it's usually caused by stress or trauma. And these compromises, in my opinion, are not good enough, because they still preserve the idea that there's some scientific merit to the idea that traumas lead to the repression of memories, and they don't use that terminology anymore, when I think there's much better explanations that could explain a correlation between trauma and dissociation, and I've already talked about some of them. So I hope you've enjoyed me just riffing a little bit on the personal frustration that I have with trauma dissociation theory, and the difficulty that we had in writing our replies to Brand et al. And so on. So there's a sociological element here that it can become very tiring for people who don't believe in a theory to debunk a theory. And you see this happening in other areas of academic life too. So you have critical theorists in humanities department, and there's scientists in scientific departments are quite skeptical of critical theory. It's not very scientific, it's not very falsifiable, but it can be a pain to spend hours or years or dedicate your life to debunking something that you don't really think is scientific. So anyway, let me wrap up this little rant of mine a little bit. I hope it helps you kind of understand what we're going through in this area. And of course, you can form your own ideas. I think, whatever your ideas are, that's fine. Just take the basic skills that you learn in research methods to apply here. So think about validity of a measure, the narrowness of a measure, about how can you use reliability and validity to know that something actually exists, and also falsifiability. That's another skill that you can use to think, how will you test that? Is it testable, a testable idea? How would you ever disprove the idea of dissociative amnesia? You can think just use those research skills, such as, if you have done an experiment in one of your studies at university, you know how hard it is to establish cause. So you can ask yourself, do these clinicians really establish that trauma is the causal agent of a memory blockage? Rather than my explanation, which would be stress leads to memory problems, or everybody forgets things, everybody has gaps in memory, and so on. So anyway, thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you soon.